Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. I'm sure you know this already. I know that you are all diligent students of the liturgical calendar, so I don't have to tell you that today is the 20th Sunday after the Feast of Pentecost. Pentecost 20 is what we're at right now, which means that we've been wearing green for a long time. We've been looking at a green chalice covering. We've been looking at a green altar frontal for a really long time now. And here's a pop quiz, if you remember from maybe 19 Sundays ago. Do you remember what we said green represents for us liturgically? Green is the color of the Holy Spirit. Green is the color of the Holy Spirit who gives us life. Green is the color of our life in the Spirit of God. So it kind of makes sense. We have this really long season, which we sometimes call ordinary time, where we're not necessarily honing in on a particular event in Christ's life, like his first coming or his death or his resurrection. Right now, we're just sort of working our way through Jesus' teachings, and we're thinking about what it means to live in the Spirit. We're thinking about the Christian life, the life of what is supposed to be continual growth in holiness. And by the way, we're reminded in this season that growth is what God wants for us. He wants us to grow. And I think we have a tendency to sometimes be content with wherever we're at spiritually. And maybe that's part of why Jesus used parables so frequently, because parables shock us, parables shake us awake, and make us more mindful of our ongoing need for self-examination, our ongoing need for more kingdom mindfulness, our ongoing need for more humility, which is what the parable we read today talks about. More humility in the Christian life. This parable this morning is a really well-known parable. I'm sure most of us here today have heard this one probably many times before. It's the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. Maybe you've heard it as the publican and the Pharisee. Publican is just an old-fashioned term for tax collector. But for as familiar as this parable is, and it is familiar, it's still very sharp. It's very sharp if we allow it to be sharp, if we're willing to hear it. This is still something that we need to hear regularly. Because what Jesus is doing in this parable is he's warning us against a kind of perennial sin, the sin of pride. And he's commending this posture of humility before God in our prayers. And of course, what happens in our prayers seeps out into the way we live and think. And in case we're sort of tempted to check out, I understand that temptation because, we know this lesson, right? We've heard this before. Pride is not good. Humility is good. We might remind ourselves of God's intention for us to grow. You may be more or less humble, but I guarantee you that we all have work to do in mirroring Jesus' humility. And that's the goal, right? The imitation of Christ, mirroring Jesus. And Jesus, Paul says, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, though he was in the form of God, but emptied himself humbly, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. We could do a whole sermon just on that passage, and we didn't even read that passage today. That's from Philippians. A beautiful description of Christ's divine humility. But the point is, imitating Jesus is what we as Christians are called to grow into. And here's the good news. Real growth is possible. possible. And how is growth possible? It's possible because of the Holy Spirit living in us. And now, the question might be, we might ask ourselves, how do we grow in holiness? How do we grow in humility when the rubber meets the road? And I think C.S. Lewis is helpful here. C.S. Lewis says this in his book, Mere Christianity, which you should read if you haven't read it. It's a very good book. But this is what C.S. Lewis says. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I can, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And here's his sort of Britishism here. He says, and that's a biggish step, too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think that you are not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. That's C.S. Lewis for you. And I think that's kind of hard to hear, but I also think he's right. If we read the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and if we don't realize that we are at least sometimes the Pharisee, that's a pretty good indication of our need for growth in humility. Before Luke gives us this parable, Luke helpfully gives us a kind of preamble. He says that Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Again, there's a temptation here, the temptation to check out. If you were to come to me and ask me do you trust in yourself for your own righteousness? I would probably say no. And then if you asked me if I despised other people, I would probably say no. So I guess I don't need to hear this parable, right? No, that's wrong. I do need to hear this parable. And I'll tell you why that's wrong. Because if I really did say no to either of those two questions, on some level, I'd be lying to you. The truth is, I do my best to not be self-righteous, and I do my best in being charitable towards other people, but sometimes I fail. And maybe I fail more than I want to admit to you. Sometimes I fail and I don't realize that I've failed until later when the Holy Spirit makes it clear to me that I have fallen short. Jesus gives us this parable to prompt us, to prompt these kinds of Holy Spirit conviction moments. It's not to shame us. Jesus doesn't give us this parable to shame us. It's not meant to make us feel miserable about ourselves. This is meant to help us grow. It's helpful to remember how a story like this would have sounded to Jesus' first audience. Keep in mind, in the first century, Pharisees were very well-respected people. To be Pharisaical did not mean hypocritical in the first century. That would not have been a bad thing. And that's not to mention that in the story itself, the parable that Jesus tells us, there's a very clear good guy and a very clear bad guy. The Pharisee is very much the guy who has done everything right, except for one thing, which we'll see. But he's lived a very righteous life. This Pharisee in this story, not only has he refrained from bad stuff like extortion and injustice and adultery, he has also done these positive things. He has fasted twice a week. He has offered a tithe out of everything that he's received. It's hard to imagine how this character could come out of this story as anything other than the one we should imitate. And I guarantee you, Jesus' first audience would have thought the same thing. That's especially true when we have this other character introduced to us, this tax collector, this betrayer. Remember, tax collectors, publicans, were not good people. They were bad people in the eyes of first century Jews. They were fellow countrymen, tax collectors were. They were fellow Jews, but they had decided to work for the enemy. They had decided to work for Rome, which in some sense made them even worse than Romans. And if that's not bad enough, they were also known for taking more than was necessary. Again, taking from their fellow Jews, and they would take that money and line their own pockets with it. That's how they would get super, super wealthy. So they were defectors, they were turncoats, and they were thieves. And everything we might have thought about the Pharisee in this parable, we can say the reverse about the tax collector. How can this man, this tax collector, come out of this story as anything other than the one we should not imitate? This is a very surprising parable. I know it's familiar, we know it so well that it's tempting to forget the surprising quality of this story. In this story, which we know, we catch a glimpse in the life of both men. They have both found themselves at the temple. They're both praying. And just FYI, prayers in the first century were typically prayed out loud. You know, the idea of internal, silent prayers was not so much of a thing as it is now. And so we get to hear what each of them is saying to God. And on the one hand, we have this Pharisee, and he is praying to God, or maybe he's just sort of speaking to himself. Jesus uses this interesting phrase, saying that the Pharisee prayed thus with himself, which is kind of curious, I think. But whatever the case, the Pharisee is saying thank you to God, not just for his own righteousness, but for his dissimilarity with other people who are less righteous than himself. God, I thank thee that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers. And then at this point, I imagine the tax collector appearing to him out of the corner of his eye, and he says this, or even like this tax collector, thank you for not making me like him. Because unlike him, and all these other unrighteous people that he has in mind, he, the Pharisee, fasts twice a week. He gives tithes of all that he gets. These are good things, worthy of imitation. But the tax collector, Jesus tells us, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, which is an act of deep sorrow for sin and penitence. And the tax collector said this, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. The guy knows that what he's done is wrong, and he knows it really, really well. And not only does he know it, but he confesses it. He makes it known to God himself. And this guy, the bad guy, is the one, surprisingly, whom Jesus wants us to imitate. Clearly not for his extortion. Clearly not for these obviously wrong things that he's done, but rather for his humility. This man has not compared himself with anyone else. He simply acknowledges how far short he's fallen on his own from God's law. And he's deeply sorry. As for the Pharisee, he has behaved rightly in his life, which is a truly good thing. Jesus doesn't want us to be confused about that. But in the end, he's puffed up about his own righteousness. And in his obedience of the law, he has somehow come out of it with disdain for his neighbor, which is clearly a perversion. What is the summary of the law, right? What does Jesus tell us? What are the two commands that all the law and the prophets hang on? Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. This Pharisee's pride has killed his love. It's so sad. It is so sad. I tell you, Jesus says, the tax collector went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. It's a kind of eschatological statement, an end-of-time statement that Jesus gives us. And now let me close with this. Let me close with one more thought from C.S. Lewis. Lewis talks about humility in some of his works, and he talks about the humility of saints, the saints of the church. When we look at the lives of saints, we see that they are very humble people. People who are very quick to acknowledge how broken they are apart from God's grace, and how far they have missed the mark in their own lives. Think about our own St. Francis. St. Francis was intent on expressing his own unworthiness before God. Francis was an incredibly humble person. But here's what Lewis points out about this kind of humility. Lewis points out that these saints are not blowing smoke. The saints are serious in their humility, in their acknowledgement of their own sin. In other words, they're not putting on a kind of false humility. We might look at the lives of the saints and see truly exemplary things, and we might wonder, what in the world would they have to be humble about? But here's the thing. Saints have a very real understanding of the weight of even the quote-unquote smallest sins that they wrestle with. So what I want us to think about this morning, and what I pray for all of us, is growth in humility. And that growth starts with prayer. Maybe we can find time. Maybe we can find time this week, even in the midst of all the things going on. Maybe we can find a quiet moment to really take stock of our prayer life. And we can ask ourselves some very intentional questions. Are we giving the Holy Spirit the time and the space in our prayers to search us out? Before we come to the altar on Sundays, are we asking the Lord to make us mindful of and sorry about our brokenness? The Lord will make us humble if we ask for it. And if that's a little scary to pray that, then we shouldn't forget what God's end game is. God's end game for us, God's plan for us is good. It's not a life of misery. It's not a life of dejection and wallowing in the dust. God's plan for us is a life of growth and fullness and joy. St. Francis, again, going back to St. Francis, he knew his sins very well and he was very sorry for them. But he wasn't miserable. He was joyful. We can be joyful. Because as we grow in humility and as we grow in knowledge of our own sinfulness, well, guess what? We also grow in our knowledge of God's love and the depth of his love for us, Jesus. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.